all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. Nurturing hearts, minds, and spirit is a very learning space. I think this is the advocacy of my guest today, no other than Miss Nancy Parks.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Miss Nancy, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. My name is Dr. Nancy Parks. I'm an education consultant with an expertise in social, emotional, and spiritual learning. I work with schools primarily, both directors of schools and teachers and students to bring social, emotional, and spiritual learning into their schools.
Miss Nancy, let's talk about the depth, urgency, and practicality of social, emotional, and spiritual learning. What critical gaps in traditional education, workplace development does SESSL feel that academic or technical skills alone cannot?
So, the first thing I want to say is that emotions are what drive our behavior. And emotions can focus our attention or they can completely shut us down from learning. We see this happen all the time with our students. If I asked you, Daniel, to think of a time when a teacher, a peer, or a colleague said something to you that motivated you to learn, that wanted you to learn more about something, I'm sure you can think of that person.
Yes,
And if I asked you to think of somebody, a colleague, a teacher, or a peer who said something that completely shut you down from learning, I'm pretty confident you could think of that as well.
definitely.
So when
Yes.
we talk about social, emotional, and spiritual learning, what we're recognizing is that the students bring their whole selves into the classroom, not just their brains. They bring their emotions and their souls as well. And we have to acknowledge that because that has a direct effect on their behavior and on their ability to learn. And when we're living in a world right now that is, let's say, there's a lot of uncertainty for a lot of our young people and even for our teachers, ignoring that doesn't mean it's not there. But by addressing it, we allow them to bring those emotions and those thoughts and those questions to the forefront, which can then allow them to enter into learning in a very different way.
Miss Nancy Parks, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. How does SESSL address rising epidemics like loneliness, anxiety,
Mhm.
and uh, is stress in Gen Z through adulthood?
Well, I think, as you point out, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of feelings of um, being overwhelmed in society today. And when you are carrying those intense emotions, whether it's in the school or, by the way, in the workplace, your level of productivity is going to be much less. And if we acknowledge it and we give space for people not only to voice what they're feeling. That's the competency of self awareness. But if we also teach them the skills to manage those intense emotions, which is called self management, we know that they can then enter, like I said, enter into that space feeling less anxious, less stressed, and more motivated. And again, if we don't acknowledge that they're bringing their emotions and these levels of anxiety with them into that space, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And
Hmm.
yet, when we give them the opportunity to express it, we actually find it mitigates the effects, the negative effects on our behavior. So it's really about not only acknowledging and giving space for it, but actually teaching them the skills to be able to manage those high intense emotions.
Very well said, Miss Nancy. Very well said.
points out that all the research shows
Yes.
that when you integrate social, emotional, and spiritual learning into any curricula, academic achievement actually increases. It doesn't take away from content knowledge, it actually increases. They find also that kids feel better about school. They find that teachers feel better about the job that they do. There's less behavioral issues. So it's a win win for everybody.
Why frame this is a spiritual, not just emotional learning?
Mm, it's a great, great question. There's been a lot of research lately about how the nourishment of the soul is really lacking, especially among children and adults right now. Now, I'm not using, I want to be clear, I'm not using soul in the metaphysical way because that might enter into a conversation about faith. And I really want to focus on this idea of soul as that inner voice, that inner peace that everybody has, and that yearning for deep connection, both with themselves and with others and with something bigger than themselves. And that's what I mean by soul and spirit and nourishing that spiritual development. Because when we feel that deep sense of connection, both with ourselves and somebody else, things like isolation decrease. We know that anxiety and depression decrease. We know that kids actually, when they feel connected to others and to a community, they actually, there's an increase in them wanting to make that community a better place, not only for themselves, but for others. And so we just can't ignore that inner soul of that student as well.
Miss Nancy, how does SESL rewrite or rewire the brain for resilience based on neuroscience?
Hmm. So there's a lot of research right now. It's a great question, Daniel. There's a lot of research on how do we actually cultivate resiliency in our children.
Yes.
And it's really about teaching them certain skills. So there's five competencies of social, emotional, and spiritual learning. The first is self-awareness. That is that ability to be able to recognize, identify, and articulate how you're feeling. The second competency is self-management. Once you know what you're feeling, how do you actually manage those emotions? Not ignore them, but manage them so that you can be productive, so that you can sometimes sit with that emotion, but then move forward, which brings in that resiliency piece. The third competency is social awareness. That is communication and listening skills. How do we build healthy relationships and maintain them with others? That has a lot to do with resiliency when you feel that you have the support of others. Then there's relationship skills, right? How do we build those interpersonal skills with other people? Social awareness, by the way, is also about perspective taking, which is really, really important. And the last one is responsible decision making, that ability to make appropriate decisions based on context. All of those skills can be taught, can be practiced, so that they all lead our children to feel like they have the skills to be able to face the uncertainty, the challenges that the world is going to offer them. And that's what builds that sense of confidence and resiliency. These are skills that can be taught and learned.
Miss Nancy, how do you define spiritual learning in a way that inclusive across belief?
Hmm. So I would say that spiritual learning has to do with really opening up space to ask questions that are about purpose and meaning, about how do you foster those deep connections. We're social animals. We want to be connected to others, but it's more than that. That spiritual component is about understanding who you are, your identity, your strengths. And so, and like I said, what is your purpose and meaning? Is it just to get a high grade in school? Is that all we're trying to teach our students? Just focusing on the mental part, their brains. Spiritual learning is about seeing the whole person and recognizing that they're bringing that into the classroom as well.
Interesting indeed, Miss Nancy. And what specific emotional skills beyond self awareness are foundational to this framework?
So there are many, many tools that you can use to build these social, emotional, and spiritual skills. When it comes to self awareness, there are many things, many mood, they're called mood meters that are out there. A mood meter is just a visual map that that has different emotions that children learn or adults learn to identify. We don't really have an emotional literacy when you think about it, Daniel. We lack emotional literacy. Um, we need to teach that emotional vocabulary so that our children understand that there's a difference between being angry and frustrated, between being sad and lonely. When they can identify how they're feeling, they can then manage that emotion very effectively as long as they understand what they're feeling. So that self-awareness is really critical. Teaching both, using mood meters as an example, and then teaching them that emotional literacy and to increase that the nuance of those emotions, naming them and articulating and then identifying them as they get older is really, really important. That starts the process of teaching that skill, certainly of self-awareness.
Miss Nancy, as educational consultant and lecturer, what are your short term and long term goals?
Mm, that's a great question. Well, I think I can certainly start with my long term goals. My long term goals is to bring social, emotional, and spiritual learning into every classroom, every school. I think it's so, so important, especially today when we have seen a rise in anxiety, seen a rise in depression and feelings of isolation. My short term goals are are trying to help teachers understand that the goal of education isn't just to teach toward a test, but rather to see the whole person and to nurture the development of that whole person. That's really hard to do today. Teachers are under a lot of pressure to teach for that test. But certainly, a short term goal would be for me to help teachers really understand um, that if they can address the emotion and spiritual and social development of their students, um, everybody everybody benefits.
Good luck to your goals, Miss Nancy, and
Thank you.
looking forward for more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be educational consultant as well as a
Hmm.
lecturer?
Well, I think my number one recommendation was to focus on what you're passionate about, to really understand it, and then to share it with the world. I
Yes.
really believe wholeheartedly that social, emotional, and spiritual learning is not a luxury that every student should have, but really a necessity. And I'm very passionate about it. And I think when I speak and when I do consulting for schools, I think they feel that. And I think that that goes a long way. Because again, Daniel, we make decisions based on emotions, not just intellect. And so if
Yes.
I can also bring them into that emotional component and build that relationship with them, I think I have a good chance of them understanding how important it is.
Thank you for your advice, Miss Nancy, and truly empowering. And kindly recommend a book that influenced you, Garni.
Mm. So I'm gonna share the first book, and if you'll give me a little bit of license, I'd like to share a second one. But the first book
Yes, go
that
ahead.
really affected my journey was called The Soul of Education by Rachel Kessler. It was written quite a few years ago, and in the book, she really talks about how, or I should say that it was the first book I read about education that didn't just focus on either pedagogy, that is, the skill of teaching, or about the importance of academics, or the way we want to engage students in order for them to achieve certain academic levels. But this book really talked about educating the whole child, and that our schools cannot be soulless, that our schools need to be able to embrace that whole aspect of the child, not just their brains, but their hearts and their souls. So that had a very, very powerful effect on me and really kind of led me on this journey. And then I would say the second book was Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. And one of the reasons why that was so powerful was because there were many examples in the book that were easily transferable to the classroom. And so it wasn't just about why why do we need to address the emotions of our students, but actually how can we? And I think that that was probably the second book.
Thank you so much for your recommendations, Miss Nancy. Hoping our listeners or people watching right now will read it and will be for sure will empower. What would SESSL driven leadership look like in action?
What would I'm sorry, I missed the second part of the question. What would SESL
Driven leadership look like in action?
Oh, leadership. Um, you know, one of the really important things about social emotional learning is that when you teach it, um, that students actually get to see it in action, and that means modeling it. So, you bring up such an important point. It's not, students are really aware of well, children in general, they're really acutely aware when our actions don't match our words.
Yes.
And so when we have leadership that embrace social emotional learning, that means that they have to also model it, both for their staff and for their students. So social emotional leadership actually is about collaboration. It's about, and what I mean by that, about working together, it's not just top down, it's giving voice to both students and teachers. It's about acknowledging again that even teachers come into the workplace with their emotions. They don't leave their emotions at home, right? Acknowledging that, giving space to understand each other and to work collaboratively is one of the biggest ways that leaders can model social, emotional, spiritual learning. And again, when they are feeling those emotions, actually modeling how they manage it. So if they're feeling anger and frustration, not yelling, not demanding, but actually pausing, taking a breath before they move forward with um, whatever behavior they want to model for the students. But it's not. It's so important that leadership be able to model that for so that people understand what it looks like in action.
Miss Nancy, how does spiritual learning translate into ethical action in communities?
Hmm. It's a great question. I think that one of the aspects about social, emotional, and spiritual learning, look, people find the nourishment of the soul in very, very different ways. And one of the ways when we talk about spirituality being connected to something bigger than yourself is actually about um, social action. And so that's directly connected to having and offering, or I should say, having caring, showing kindness, compassion for others. And that absolutely blends into what are your values? What are your ethics? And so I think that there's an, there's an, it's easy to talk about your values and your identity when you think about social, emotional, and spiritual learning because they're intimately connected.
Intimately connected, people. We are all connected as human, for
For
sure.
sure. For
Can
sure.
can SESL work as a systemic levels like policy, organization, culture, or many more?
I'll tell you, Daniel, that's the goal, right? We don't
Mm.
want social emotional learning to stay confined to the classroom. We absolutely want it to be systemic and to reach out into the communities. And there is evidence that that is happening in some communities, but it takes leadership at the highest level and often sometimes even in government to understand the importance of social, emotional, and spiritual learning. That's the big obstacle right now is how do we take social emotional learning, not keep it confined to the classroom, not keep it confined to the school, but actually allow it to expand outside of the walls of a school or a classroom. So I don't, that would be a dream come true if I could see that really happening in communities.
Well, looking forward for that, Miss Nancy, and please do come over and update us. And before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and of course my book 101 review in its fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and food 101 in its fifth season as well. Geography 101 in its fourth season, and Law 101 in first season as well. This is my baby podcast together with Mental Health 101, Love Letters in third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in its fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. Miss Nancy, what the single most transformative outcome you've witnessed from SESL?
Mm. I've actually seen schools, classrooms and schools. I don't want to minimize that this certainly starts with the classroom, but I've actually seen the culture of classrooms and schools change to be one of kindness and compassion and caring. And I think that that's something that's so absent in the world today, especially when people feel so isolated. And I think that social, emotional, and spiritual learning, when it is integrated into curricula, into the daily schedules of schools and even the workplace, it leads, it transforms places to become places of kindness, caring, and compassion.
Definitely. And Miss Nancy, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And
Thank
we
you for
are
having me.
hoping, yes, we are hoping for more and more and more empowering advocacy to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your business, your advocacy, or other projects that you are doing right now?
So if anybody wants to contact me, my website is nancyparksconsulting.com. I'm currently writing a book, so hopefully that will get out soon as well. And you can also um, subscribe to my newsletter, which you can find on my website.
Miss Nancy, I'm looking forward for that book, and you are most welcome to come back and let's talk about it on Book 101 Review.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for having me.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Nancy Parks because if you support her, as I said, more and more empowering upcoming books to come, more and more empowering coaching to come, and of course, more and more empowering advocacy to come. So, Miss Nancy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.